G'day and welcome back for another Space Engineers tutorial. Today we're going to be taking a look at wheels and rovers. I love building with wheels and rovers in Space Engineers. There's something about the way they move and there's something about wheeled vehicles that is just a little bit more interesting than simply flying around. However, if you're wanting to do something the easy way, you'll almost always go for a flying vehicle. The ease with which they can move around and the speed with which they can move around just can't be surpassed by what wheels can do. Saying that though, wheels do have one advantage over thrusters and flying vehicles. If you've got something on wheels, it's going to take a lot less power to get that vehicle and all of its goodies from one place to another, assuming it can cross the terrain. So, if you are low on power, you could argue that using something with wheels would be a good solution. There's an alternative viewpoint to that though, which is just build more generators, but since wheels are so much fun, I'm going to build stuff with them anyway. In fact, there are a number of situations where I will deliberately choose to build a wheeled vehicle, even though I know it is not the best option, just because I like building them. In order to start your first rover design off, what you want to do is go to your G menu and grab a couple of things. Let's clear off this hotbar here by right-clicking on the items, and we'll first grab our wheel suspension. We won't be using these wheels. These wheels are more decorative. There are some advanced uses for them, but in general, considering them as decorative is probably the way to go for now. The next thing we need is a landing gear, and for right now, that's about it. When I start off any small grid ship, I will start off with a landing gear. That's because even when unwelded, they will lock to the ground. So I can place this and it will just lock. Then I've got a sturdy platform to build from. However, if you drop it from the height that I just did, or if you're on fairly uneven ground, you may want to place something down first so that they're level. If we get a large grid light armor block and we place it embedded in the voxels, it'll be fixed in place, and then we can press 2 twice to get our small landing gear and drop it on there, and we'll have a nice level starting point. Let's get rid of these two. And from this level starting point, what we want to do is build a bit of an extension upward and outward so that we can have somewhere easy to build from where we can move around with our engineer in all directions, get underneath the vehicle, get above it, that sort of thing, so that we've got that freedom of movement while we're building. This is about the size I normally build unless I know I've got a particularly large construction planned. Something that's about 8 and about 10 to 12 blocks along, which gives me enough room for all 3 sizes of wheels. Let's bring this down a little bit, and then I'm going to make a central spine for the vehicle. You can design this any way you like. I just tend to find that building a central axis for a wheeled vehicle helps me with the construction as I go along. Let's take a look at the wheels. So we've got 3 different types of wheels with left and right variations on both. The left and right variations are a purely graphical difference. All they do is give you a tread that won't look funny with one side mirrored to the other. So instead of having one side with the tread facing one way and the other facing the other way, it all looks normal. Let's start by placing our 1x1 right, which gives us quite a tiny little wheel. Then we'll go our 3x3, Then we'll place our 3x3 wheel, and you'll notice the way that I've placed this is quite deliberate. These things do have an up and a downside. The upside to a wheel suspension is the side that looks a little bit like an elbow. The next size up is our 5x5 wheel. This thing is pretty hefty. It's got a much larger suspension model than the ones for the 3x3 or the 1x1s. This thing is 2x2 on its backplate. That means you've got to keep in mind the size if you're going to be dealing with 5x5 wheels. The nice thing about them though is this extra clearance. This thing has about 2.5 blocks of clearance between the bottom of the wheel at its lowest point on the suspension and the bottom of the suspension attachment. The 3x3 wheels have a small amount, it's like 1.5 blocks, which isn't too bad. And the 1x1s have less than a block, so you really don't want to be going across anything even slightly bumpy with these sorts of wheels. What I've also placed here is a pair of 1x1 wheels, the one on the right being our left wheel suspension and the one on the right being our right, and you can see that the treads are just mirror images of each other. Something else to quickly talk about with wheels and their suspensions is where things can attach to them. the 1x1s and 3x3s, blocks can attach around all 4 sides. So you can have something attached on the sides and you do not need to have anything attached to the back of it, and it will still stay fixed. The same is true of the 1x1s. However, the 5x5s are a little bit different. You can attach stuff to their sides, no troubles, but not to the top and not to the bottom. So if you're planning on having this hanging below your vehicle, you will need to have something attached on the back in order to have it as part of the same vehicle and not just drop straight off. Building a rover doesn't require much in the way of blocks. All you need is a few wheels, some power source, and a way to control it. Once you've got that, you'll be able to drive. Instead of going for something really small though, I'm going to show you building something a little bit larger, because you're likely to want to go for something larger fairly early on. What we're going to do is build something big enough to carry our miner and a bunch of ores to and from a mining deposit. So for example, our cobalt, if we pop the GPS marker back on, is 5.3 kilometers away. If we are able to get there with our wheels, we could bring the miner over to there, load up say 3 loads, and then drive it back, and the miner will have only had to fly a few hundred meters, versus if we did those 3 loads with the miner from the base, it would have had to travel 30 kilometers. So we would save a lot of flight time and a lot of power usage. The reason I want to go with something this large is because then we get to talk about how we can balance the weight and how we can best create a rover that's going to be stable and fun to drive. To demonstrate a few things about our design that we're going to need to consider, I brought in this little vehicle. This thing has a very wide wheelbase and it has a very low center of gravity. So the chances of it rolling as I turn tightly around a corner are very, very small, but it is still doable, as you can see. The wider we can make the wheelbase and the lower that we can make the center of mass, the less chance we have of rolling. We can also use suspension setups to improve that. If I were to add something heavy like this cargo container full of cobalt, this is going to make me much more likely to roll because that center of mass is now much, much higher. Similarly, if I place something heavy behind my last set of wheels or towards the rear of the vehicle, I'm going to have troubles then too, as this cargo container is so heavy that I now can't move. So you need to think about mass distribution across your wheelbase as you're building the vehicle. And in our case, we're going to need to have some heavy cargo containers full of ore, as well as a heavy mining vehicle to keep in mind as we design our build. So let's talk about what we're going to build. What we want is a spot for our mining ship to land, so we'll need a connector. We also need to have a cockpit. We would like a power source, so we'll use batteries. We'll need cargo space, and we could use large cargo containers or we could use medium cargo containers. An advantage of the medium ones is we'll have a bit more flexibility in terms of mass distribution across the vehicle. Because these are a bit lower, we'll be able to keep the center of mass of the whole vehicle lower by using these. We're also going to need some conveyor tubes, and we're going to need some small conveyor tubes. Our vehicle is going to be quite heavy with everything, and to give us a bit more flexibility in where we place things, let's add a bit of extra width. Let's go out another 2 blocks, and then we'll place down our left 5x5 suspension. I need to get myself out of the way, otherwise when I place this, it's going to say wheel could not be placed. If we have a control panel, and the easiest way to get a control panel to access is by building a control panel, we can then grab our wheel suspension and click add wheel. And you can see we've now got a wheel attached to this suspension ready to be built. For our design, we're going to have our cockpit up the front, sitting relatively neatly between the front 2 wheels. Then we'll have some cargo storage and our batteries in behind there, and then we'll have our landing platform for our miner. The challenge with a build like this is going to be making sure that this is relatively stable both loaded and unloaded. And by unloaded, I mean with just the mining ship aboard and without the ballast up the front here to balance out the weight of the miner. So we'll want the connection point for the miner to be relatively far forward in front of the rearmost wheels. Before we place our rear wheels on, let's lay out the design of the core components. The advantage in doing it this way is that we'll know where everything is, and we'll have a rough idea of where we need to place the wheels in order to balance the mass of the things that are going to be aboard. First thing I'm going to do is place one of these conveyor junctions behind our cockpit with one of the large ports facing upward. The reason we want it facing upwards is that we're then going to attach the large port of a connector directly on top, and with the large ports facing out sideways, we can put a medium cargo container here and another one here. If we want to get even more storage aboard, we can then place another one side by side, and these will, let's get into a spot where we can see it, and these will connect to each other through those small ports on the side. There's also a small port on the back of this conveyor junction, so we can line up to that. So this is all nicely connected between all of these blocks, at least for small objects like ores, which is what we're going to be moving with this thing. The next thing we're going to need to add onto here is going to be our battery, and we can place a single battery in the middle here, but we probably don't want to place it right there. Maybe instead let's place 2 batteries, because there is a side port on this thing that we want to be able to access. Our connector on our mining ship is pretty close to the rear. Let's give ourselves 2 blocks between the batteries and this connector. We could pop it here, but it might be better if we grind down those blocks and move it down another layer so that we get it even lower, since we've got that bit of extra space thanks to the 5x5 wheel suspensions. Since our conveyor port for our connector is on the side, let's place a few blocks like that. And then we can grind away that one and we'll be able to access it. These blocks are fine because they're at the same height as our suspension, so we would hope that we won't be dropping lower than that anyway. But if you wanted to, you could use something like half slabs to give yourself that extra 25 centimeters of clearance. We've now got our heavy bit up the front, at least when it's all loaded up, and our heavy bit for the rear. I think to keep this relatively balanced, we probably want to have 4 wheels at the back here, and especially so that we can go up steeper slopes, we want those extra wheels to be able to push. So what we're going to do is put that out to there and then attach our rearmost wheels here. So that's 4 blocks behind the connector, and then we can place our other wheels directly underneath it. We're also going to need to place a couple of armor blocks on top of these so that we can attach our wheels at the same height as the front ones. Grab our 5x5 lefts and we'll add one there. And we'll add another one there. We'll fix up that wheel that couldn't be placed by going into our control panel. You can just grab every wheel rather than finding which one it is and click add wheel and it will do it anyway. Then with our rights, let's place them down. Keeping in mind that it's nice to have these things all at the same elevation. Not strictly required. You can create a vehicle that's slightly nose tilted down or nose tilted up. It's just easier to do it this way. What I also did when placing these wheels was place the front wheels first, then the middle, then the rear. I find that this is helpful later on when you're looking in the control panel to know which wheel is which, if you know that the lowest number is always the forwardmost wheel, and then it goes backwards in sequence. The last thing we're going to do is we're going to place a gyroscope or 2 on here. The advantage of a gyroscope is that we can use them to prevent ourselves from rolling, especially when we're carrying such a valuable load. One little thing that I did forget to do just then was pipe up our cargo container to our connector. Let's use a small conveyor tube. And this is going to be interesting because I haven't left myself much room to get around, so we may need to go underneath. One thing to note while you're grinding down any blocks that might be in the way on your vehicle is to pay very close attention to what is attached to what, and making sure that the whole thing is still attached when you grind away a block that you want to get rid of. So adding in extra supports is often a good idea, even if you're going to be just grinding away them later, or welding up stuff that you know is going to be important so that it's harder to accidentally break it when you don't want to. I am speaking from personal experience here, having broken stuff that was very, very painful to get back together. And then it is time to weld this whole thing up. There are a fair few blocks here, and you may need to take another mining trip with your mining ship to get enough resources. I probably will. Plus, it's a lot of welding to do. So, instead of just jumping straight into the welding, let's hop over to our production tab, go to our tools menu, and let's make a better grinder and a better welder. We can do that because we've got the cobalt we need. The basic one just needs iron, nickel, and gravel, whereas the enhanced welder needs iron, nickel, cobalt, and silicon. So let's make one of them and one of them. I'm not going to worry about the drill since I'm hoping I won't be hand drilling again anytime soon. Grab that from the assembler, grab the other one. Let's put the grinder and the welder into the assembler. We can then go to production, go to disassembly, and since we're not using these, let's break down our welder and our grinder to get the resources back from them. Then we need to add our new tools to our hotbar. Go to character tools and drag your welder and your grinder to the spots on your hotbar that you want them to be in. Now we're good to do some serious welding. As our vehicle is now, it is technically drivable. We could grind this off and drive away right now. I'm not going to do that because right now it's also very, very flimsy. If I take a rock or if I take a hit to the wrong spot, we're going to lose whole wheels and whole segments of this truck. So I think it's important with these sorts of designs to ensure that you have multiple connections between 2 points if you can afford them in your design. One little tip about aesthetic design with armor around a vehicle like this is that often less is more. What I mean by that is keeping some of these intricately designed blocks exposed can usually make your build look nicer, as long as you still leave them looking supported. So these cargo containers have a lot more detail than my armor blocks, so I'm going to leave them mostly exposed. Since I built this mostly at night, I realized something that I had forgotten in terms of adding to this build, and that is some way to light up the ground. Spotlights have a very narrow beam. That means we want to place them high and wide so that they can illuminate as much of the terrain in front of us as possible. For our little rover, this spot on top of the cargo containers should work out fairly nicely. And just to continue things, let's pop a half slab in between there and there. And there we go. Let's hop in the cockpit. And we can turn those lights on and off with the L key while we're in the cockpit. So let's turn them off since spotlights do use up some power. And we should be ready to go. So let's loose this thing. If I cut it off here, it'll drop to the ground. I can then remove this bit of scaffolding. So as it is, I have got the wheels 100% default. And we can already drive quite nicely. It handles reasonably well. We can get up to a good speed. And if we turn sharply, we don't do too badly. This is a relatively stable vehicle, which is nice. That's part of why I built it this way. It was intended to be as stable as possible. And it'll be pretty hard for us to roll, even at fairly high speeds, although you can see that we are starting to tilt a little bit. Be careful. Careful, careful, careful. So if we want to improve that handling, maybe we'll start by making just the front wheels steer, since that will make us a bit more stable turning at speed. We press K and go to our control panel, and select this left 2, 3 and right 2, 3 because we placed first wheel, second wheel, third wheel, and turn steering off. That's our first option we've got available with our wheels. Now, when we turn left and right with the A and D keys, we only turn with our front 2 wheels, which means when we turn at speed, I'm pretty sure we will have all manner of difficulty trying to roll this thing. I would have to set my speed much higher or be on some sort of awkward slope for this to roll. Hold down spacebar to brake, and it might be nice to have a park brake here too. So let's press G, let's grab our cockpit, and we will select handbrake on and off. We've got an option to say whether the wheel will provide propulsion. We've got an option to say whether it will brake. Then we've got an option for air shock. Air shock is when you drop from a big height and you've got fairly soft suspension. If the suspension detects that it's being triggered rather rapidly, it will then become more stiff. The strength of the suspension will increase so that it will resist that compression to a greater extent. We've got options for invert steering and propulsion. If you've got an unusually shaped vehicle with multiple wheels in strange places, you may find that the default setup for the wheel is the wrong way round, so you can invert it and fix it that way. For the most part, if you build vehicles with a layout of wheels similar to how you would see on any vehicle on the roads today, you will probably be fine with the default. Next up, we've got our steering angle. So if I crank this way up to 46 degrees, and that's our left wheel, you'll see that when I turn, the left wheel is now turning a lot further than the right. If I set the steering angle to both of the front wheels to the maximum of 46 degrees, now when we're up at speed, we will be able to almost roll the vehicle or potentially roll it all the way over because they're turning that much more. So you need to keep in mind that these angles might have other effects other than making it really easy or difficult to park. So let's reduce those back down to a more reasonable level. And if we want to get back to the default, we can simply right click on the slider. If you want to get a specific value for a slider, control and left click on it and you will get this dialog box up so you can type in the value directly. Next up, we've got power. Power is the amount of force going through the wheel. So this is the equivalent of how hard you're pushing down on the accelerator. We'll leave it at 60 since that seems to be fairly reasonable for this vehicle, but we may need to push it up higher when we're fully loaded. Next up, we've got our suspension strength. This is the amount of force the suspension will apply to resist any compression of the suspension, so any movement of the wheel upwards along the suspension rails. If we set this to a really low value, there'll be almost no resistance, and if we set it to a really high value, there'll be lots of resistance. To really demonstrate this, I'm going to pop the miner on top of our vehicle. And before we connect to our truck, I'm going to add one more control to my hotbar. Let's go into our control panel. Let's show hidden blocks because we've got some hidden thrusters. And we will grab all of our thrusters and call them miner thrusters. It's a good habit, and it's one that I'm terrible at, to name groups and even name blocks for the specific vehicle they are in. That way, if you're connected up to a base, it's a lot easier to find and know which the new blocks are and which blocks belong to what. So with our miner thrusters group created, we can then press G, go to groups, and find our miner thrusters group, right click on that, and select toggle block on and off. Not ideal to have both of these on the hotbar next to each other, but for now we'll just leave it. What we want to do is connect to our rover. And you can see when I disconnect and connect, the thrusters increase their power output substantially. What they seem to be doing is basically trying to lift off with the rover. And it's quite heavy, so they can't really do that, so they just burn through lots of power. If we connect and either turn off our dampeners or turn off our thrusters, then we'll sit nicely on the connector and not waste any power. Similarly to what we just did with the thrusters, I'm going to grab our wheels and call these carrier wheels. Press G, go to our groups, right click on this, and we're going to set increase strength and decrease strength to our hotbar. That way we can change these as we're driving around. You can already see with this higher center of mass that we are much more likely to roll. So let's drop our suspension strength down a bit. That might be a bit too far. Now when we turn, it takes a little more effort for the wheels to lift off the ground because the suspension on the other side compresses, allowing the body to roll with the wheels all remaining in contact with the ground. With the suspension much stronger, when we turn, we tend to roll much more easily. So there is an advantage to dropping that down to a level that suits your vehicle and the mass it has at any one time. The reason I wanted to show you how to put this on the hotbar is it's really quite handy when you're needing to adjust, and particularly for something that carries cargo, to have these so you can dynamically adjust your suspension settings as you're going around and as you need to change them. Let's have a look at the next thing on our wheels. Height offset is the distance the wheels want to sit from the center of the suspension. So this is currently 50 centimeters below here. If I reduce this or bring this towards 0, you'll see that once it reaches 0, or about 0, the suspension is sitting perfectly level with the center of the wheel. And then we can set it above, but really we want it below as far as possible when we're moving around on terrain like this. One of the situations where you may want to change that is if you're building something on rails, but for most purposes you will want that height offset as far to the left as possible, which is why it's the default. Next up, we've got our friction, which is simply the amount of grip our wheels have, and 50% is usually a fairly safe value. There might be times when you're going up a steep hill or parking on a steep hill where you want to have that higher. Then we have our speed limit. 180 kilometers an hour on an unpaved surface is very, very fast. Maybe we should set this a little bit lower. Let's try 90. 90 will keep us very safe. Next up, we've got propulsion override and steer override. These don't have much of a role on a single grid vehicle like this where we're in the cockpit and controlling it directly, but there are some situations where you won't be in a cockpit and you'll want your wheels to move, and this is where those come in. So, I think for our purposes, we want our suspension strength to be about 15 for now. As we sink a little bit down, which means there's a bit of softness, we'll leave our friction at 50 for now, we'll keep our speed limit at 90 and power at 60, but what we'll also do is we'll add our power to our hotbar so we can increase that as well as our friction. I would strongly recommend having a pattern to how you arrange these so that you always do it the same way, otherwise it would get very confusing what you're modifying when. So aside from a quick paint job, that's our rover done. This thing can take our mining ship over to anywhere it can reach. There are a couple of things about terrain that I want to point out. Trees are, well, they're less of a worry than you think. They don't tend to cause grids any damage, at least not directly. I can plow through that without much worry at all. But there are situations where they can sometimes flip your grid and cause you damage through you landing on the very hard ground. The other thing to note is that there are many areas on the planets in Space Engineers that are very, very rough. Usually these areas are on the transitions between flat, nice to drive on regions like this grassland and areas going steeper uphill, but sometimes they are hidden in the grass. Keep an eye out for this sort of terrain like you can see in front of me. This is not good driving terrain. These ruts and these jagged edges, they will destroy most small grid vehicles. In addition to extra stability, one of the reasons I added gyroscopes to our truck was to allow us to have some control if we accidentally get some air. And the easiest way to demonstrate getting some air is another little trick you can do with wheels. Just making sure I'm not driving straight at the base. If you hold down X, you will compress your suspension, and then when you release it, your suspension will throw you up in the air, and now I can use my gyroscope to make sure that I land on all of my wheels, which hopefully will keep me from destroying this thing as I land. Now that it's got a bit of a paint job, I'd say this rover is mostly complete. It certainly will be functional. We'll be able to load up with a fair amount of ore over at any of the deposits, bring it back to the base, and then have to shuttle it by hand or with the mining ship onto the base, because we've got no means to connect to the base right now. So, next time we're going to be doing a bunch of things with pistons. First off, we're going to build a connector to attach our hauling rover to the base, and then we're going to use pistons and drills to make a giant hole in the ground with stone feeding directly into our refinery so that we can generate a whole lot of iron, nickel, and silicon. So there's all that and plenty more to come, and I will see you then.